Margaret Thatcher was undoubtedly conscious of her new status and pleased with it. Her dealings with her ministers reflected her new dominance. One official, David Goodall, witnessed this firsthand during the summer of 1982. In Cabinet, Mrs. Thatcher's authority seemed absolute, and her manner was that of a headmistress dealing with recalcitrant staff. Willie Whitelaw, massive, bushy eyebrows raised, was allowed something of a moderating role, but her other male colleagues seemed uncertain how to disagree with her without provoking rebuke. As someone said, she came across as though she were everyone's mother in a bad temper. It had always been Mrs. Thatcher's way to hector her colleagues, but in the past this tendency had been somewhat restrained by her inexperience and the weakness of her own political position. Now these restraints were lessened. An official himself, Goodall noted how the situation was less irksome for his breed than for her fellow politicians. Often outspokenly rude to ministers, especially as time went on to Geoffrey Howe, and invariably acerbic in argument, she was never, in my experience, actually rude to officials. He described her thus: "At a meeting, there is something actually repellent about the poisoned smile and didactic way in which she reiterates her points. In informal conversation, she sheds her scaly covering, her smile becomes normal, her femininity apparent, and one can argue with her in a friendly, even bantering way." Addressing her party conference in October, she said that the Falklands had not brought about the recovery of British patriotism, but had proved that such patriotism was never really lost. At the end of 1982, for a television programme broadcast in March 1983, Mrs. Thatcher showed the South African writer Sir Lawrence van der Post round 10 Downing Street. Disarmed by his flattery, she revealed how much her choice of pictures and decorations for the house was influenced by her self-identification with the high points of Britain's greatness. She pointed out the Chinese Chippendale table which had belonged to Clive of India, Pitt the Younger's desk, and the portraits of Nelson and Wellington. "I thought of him very much because I was very upset at the people who had lost their lives in the Falklands." In the cabinet room, she pointed out, she sat in Winston's chair. The world's heightened expectations of Mrs. Thatcher and her own post-Falklands rhetoric about the British commitment to freedom was soon put to the test by the issue of Hong Kong. The island of Hong Kong itself had belonged to Britain absolutely since 1842, but the surrounding new territories, on which Hong Kong Island depended for, among other things, water, were rented from China on a 99-year lease which would expire in 1997. In any case, China rejected Britain's rights over both freehold and leasehold, claiming that they had been extorted by unequal treaties. Since Britain could not sustain its claim to the new territories after 1997, it was obvious some new arrangement for Hong Kong would have to be agreed. China wanted the whole place back. Although the Chinese leader, Deng Xiaoping, had told Hong Kong businessmen in 1979 to set their hearts at ease about the preservation of the capitalist system there, huge doubts remained. The markets and citizens of Hong Kong were becoming increasingly nervous. In approaching the subject, Mrs. Thatcher had no clear model to follow. Hong Kong was not a typical British colony whose people could be given independence, because independence was not on offer. What loomed was the absorption of a free entity, and worse, a free people, into the dictatorship of the communist mainland. Emotionally, though not physically, ethnically, or economically, Hong Kong more closely resembled the Falklands. Most of its people were pro-British and dreaded the rule of the country which laid claim to it. But unlike in the Falklands, there was a lease which was running out, a land border with the hostile power and the overwhelming might, in the last resort, of the People's Liberation Army. In January 1982, suggestions for her visit to China, planned for late September, were set out by the Permanent Undersecretary at the Foreign Office. One of the main objectives was to contain public expectations of progress so that confidence in Hong Kong is not undermined. Mrs. Thatcher jibbed at this. Her Foreign Affairs Private Secretary, John Coles, offered a stronger alternative. To confirm that in discussions with the Chinese on Hong Kong's future, our aim will be to secure a prosperous and secure future for the people of Hong Kong. I much prefer your version, Mrs. Thatcher scribbled to Coles. Sir Percy Craddock, the British ambassador in Peking, argued that the Chinese were determined to assert the sovereignty they believed they had never truly surrendered. Unless Britain surrendered sovereignty in 1997, there would be confrontation. He tried to reassure the Prime Minister that Deng Xiaoping would stick to any agreement he made. Mrs. Thatcher was not sure what she should do, but she was sure that what she could not do, particularly in the light of the recent Falkland Islands problem, was simply to announce that we had conceded sovereignty over Hong Kong. Mrs. Thatcher arrived in Peking on the 22nd of September. The next day, she met the Chinese Premier, Zhao Ziyang. Just before heading into their meeting, Zhao told reporters that China will certainly take back its sovereignty over Hong Kong. This effort to preempt the issue publicly infuriated the British. I realise that some of these points may be unwelcome, but I must be candid, Mrs. Thatcher told Zhao. Confidence in Hong Kong, and thus its continued prosperity, depend on British administration. What she wanted was an agreement with China which would define the new arrangements. If she were satisfied that they were acceptable to the people of Hong Kong, then there would be a new situation in which I could consider the question of sovereignty. In reply, Zhao was polite but firm. The capitalist system in Hong Kong would remain, but the return of sovereignty to China could not be delayed after 1997. If it came to a choice, sovereignty would take precedence over prosperity. The following morning, Mrs. Thatcher met Deng Xiaoping. Those present at the meeting were conscious of an air of unease and of two formidable individuals confronting one another. Robin Butler remembered a great diatribe by Deng, with Mrs. Thatcher being pretty equally aggressive. While she spoke, Deng started hawking and expectorating into the spittoon, which was uncomfortably near to her. She moved her legs. It threw her, Butler recalled. Once Deng had heard Mrs. Thatcher repeat her points about sovereignty and confidence, he declared that without recovered sovereignty, his government ought to retire voluntarily from the political arena. Why should Britain not want to abandon its claim? Britain should be pleased to end its colonial era. Mrs. Thatcher hit back. Her duty, which she felt deeply, was to reach a result acceptable to the people of Hong Kong. She wanted talk based on a certain formula, which would reassure people, British administration after 1997. Deng flatly refused. He made dark remarks about the danger of disturbances in Hong Kong. Mrs. Thatcher snapped back that if there were disturbances, they would not be caused by Britain. The outside world would draw its own conclusions. After 2.5 hours, according to Robin Butler, it all seemed disastrous. But then, when the question of a communiqué about the meeting was raised, a form of words provided by Craddock, which said nothing about sovereignty, made quick progress. At first, the Chinese wanted the statement to mention differences between the two countries, but this was replaced by the more emollient, both leaders made clear their respective positions on this subject. The statement also said that both sides wished to secure the stability and prosperity of Hong Kong and agreed to start talks. To British surprise, the thing went through as easy as anything. Deng snapped his fingers in approval. However, it showed how the Chinese government wished to make life uncomfortable for Mrs. Thatcher, that as she gave the return banquet to her hosts in the Great Hall of the People that evening, most of the leadership did not attend, but caroused with the North Korean dictator Kim Il-sung in another part of the building. Lord Butler recalled that the British team were also ill-treated by being given inferior accommodation. Only Dennis Thatcher overcame this indignity by complaining so loudly, in the apparent privacy of his own room, that he did not have a gin and tonic, that the eavesdroppers arranged for some to be supplied. After the election victory of June 1983, Sir Percy Craddock and the Foreign Office were instructed by the Cabinet to negotiate with China about the arrangements post-1997, arrangements between then and 1997, and matters relating to a transfer of sovereignty, in that order. Although Craddock and the new Foreign Secretary, Geoffrey Howe, often found Mrs. Thatcher tiring to deal with, they also appreciated her utility when they talked to China. She was marvellous, recalled Howe, as a card off stage. In the view of Charles Pole, who became her Foreign Affairs Private Secretary the following summer, her original, ridiculously unobtainable goals made it possible for Britain to demand and get more than anyone would otherwise have dared. "If the Chinese think you're being difficult," she told the Foreign Office, "just tell them who can be really, really difficult." When agreement was finally reached, Mrs. Thatcher agreed to fly to Peking. Before signing, Mrs. Thatcher met Deng in the Great Hall of the People. He was grown old and deaf, and there was a lot of shouting at him down an ear trumpet. Deng told Mrs. Thatcher that the agreement had historic significance, and that China would honour it. Mrs. Thatcher asked Deng why he had agreed to one of the most precious features of the deal, which was that one country, two systems would last for at least 50 years from 1997. He answered that it was because China hoped to approach the economic level of advanced countries by the end of that time. She was actually rather impressed by him, Pole judged. Here was this tiny figure who exerted absolute control over 1.3 billion people. He dominated the others, who were plainly enthralled to him. Did she warm to him as a human? No. He was a communist and a tyrant. Just after Geoffrey Howe reached agreement in Peking at the end of July 1984, Mrs. Thatcher was sent examples of the largely favourable Hong Kong press reaction. One pro-Peking paper said that it took an iron lady to have the courage to end British colonialism. Mrs. Thatcher underlined this and wrote an exclamation mark beside it. The paper's comment had been intended as a compliment, but it was not one she could cheerfully accept. On the 9th of February 1984, the Soviet leader Andropov died. 2 years earlier, Mrs. Thatcher had refused to attend Brezhnev's funeral, but she now made the trip to Moscow. "The funeral is a godsend," she told Vice President Bush shortly before she set off. The question now, continued the notes of their meeting, was what to do next. Mrs. Thatcher's mere presence created a good impression with her hosts. During the outdoor ceremony, she endured Moscow's frigid temperatures stoically, helped by a hot water bottle concealed about her person. There was also much excitement about her bodyguard, Detective Superintendent Parker. He was a large man, and it was a very wintry occasion. He would shadow her everywhere with enormous bulging pockets. Russian security were deeply impressed by this heavily armed man. Then they got to the Kremlin afterwards to attend the reception. She took off her coat and then unzipped her boots, whereupon Detective Superintendent Parker produced a pair of high-heeled shoes from his pockets. The Russians were rather disillusioned. Once the obsequies had been concluded, Mrs. Thatcher met Andropov's successor, Konstantin Chernenko. Tony Bishop, who interpreted for Mrs. Thatcher, recalled that it was for her like meeting an ailing member of her father's generation. She treated him with every civility, trying hard to draw him out a little, but with no great success. On the plane home, discussing the trip with her small team of advisers, she made her frustration with Chernenko clear. "For heaven's sake," she exclaimed, Try and find me a young Russian." The Foreign Office was already at work on this task. They swiftly settled on Gorbachev, who, under Chernenko, became the de facto number 2 in the Soviet hierarchy. He also assumed the honorific position of chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Supreme Soviet. This made him the automatic person to invite to Britain as leader of a parliamentary delegation, a device which avoided any problems of intergovernment protocol. His invitation, which made clear that Gorbachev would meet senior government figures as well as backbench MPs, was sent in mid-June. For a long time, it received no reply. In mid-October 1984, just after the Brighton bomb, Mrs. Thatcher received a handwritten note from Charles Pole. "Gorbachev has just accepted an invitation to the UK and wants to come in December." When a letter arrived from the Foreign Office officially confirming the acceptance, Pole wrote on it, "Will you see him here, Downing Street, or invite him to your dacha?" Mrs. Thatcher preferred her dacha, writing, "Lunch at Chequers." Under Charles Pole's guidance, a lunch was organised which would permit the maximum freedom of discussion. Originally, Gorbachev's wife, Raisa, was excluded, but when Dennis intimated that he would be at Chequers, and therefore at the lunch, Mrs. Thatcher directed Pole to invite Mrs. Gorbachev as well. The British used their mole, Oleg Gordievsky, to assist in their preparations for the visit. What excited Mrs. Thatcher about Gordievsky was the value of his political information. Gordievsky's dispatches conveyed to her, as no other information had done, how the Soviet leadership reacted to Western phenomena, and indeed to her. He reported that the Politburo had been greatly impressed by her demeanour at Andropov's funeral. Smart, serious, dignified, properly dressed, and more than just the Iron Lady. As Gordievsky himself put it, "Because she knew of me from an early stage, she started to think of them, the Russians, not as robots, but as human beings." The main human being who started to feature in his reports was Mikhail Gorbachev. Mikhail Gorbachev and his wife Raisa arrived for lunch at Chequers on Sunday the 16th of December 1984. Present were Mrs. Thatcher and Dennis, and Whitelaw, Howe, Heseltine, Malcolm Rifkind, Paul Channon, and because Gorbachev had supervised agriculture for much of his career, the Minister of Agriculture, Michael Jopling. At the drinks beforehand, Gorbachev wanted solely to talk about agriculture, which rather nonplussed the very unagricultural Mrs. Thatcher. But as soon as they sat down to lunch, our conversation, as Gorbachev remembered it, took a rather polemic tone. According to the British interpreter Tony Bishop, Mrs. Thatcher deliberately and breathtakingly set about serially cross-examining him about the inferiority of the Soviet centralized command system and the merits of free enterprise and competition. The contemporary record bears this out. Mrs. Thatcher asked Gorbachev how people could possibly better themselves in a centralized and rigid economy. He replied that in the Soviet Union, the availability of jobs was already solved. Mrs. Thatcher then attacked Soviet 5-year plans. Gorbachev said he understood that the British system was different, but the Soviet system was superior. He invited Mrs. Thatcher to come and have a look for herself. She would see how Soviet people lived, joyfully. Reading the record later, Mrs. Thatcher underlined this last word and added an exclamation mark beside it. Next, the Prime Minister complained about the Soviet treatment of dissidents, like Andrei Sakharov and Anatoly Sharansky, and of refusnik Jews in general. Gorbachev declined to answer, reminding her that they had not completed their discussion of the two economic systems. Mrs. Thatcher took this as her cue to start on the miners' strike. She said that people like Scargill and his communist vice president, Mick McGahey, gave Soviet communism a bad name. She accused communists in Britain of taking over the trade unions under Labour colours and infiltrating the Labour Party because they could not win parliamentary seats under their own banner. Gorbachev took this rightly as an attack on the Soviet Union. This was the first he had heard of this. Did the Prime Minister really think, he asked, that his country could run a miners' strike or manipulate British public opinion? Mrs. Thatcher replied that she didn't mind foreign propaganda because she could prove that the British system was better. But the Soviet Union's fellow communists who could not get their own way through the ballot box were opting for violence. Then she challenged him almost directly. They were also being helped with finance from outside. Gorbachev stoutly and mendaciously denied the accusation. The Soviet Union had transferred no funds to the NUM. At this, the official record added, he amended this to, as far as I am aware. He went on the offensive. The Prime Minister should blame Britain and not foreign communists for the situation. Das Kapital had been written in London. Mrs. Thatcher interjected that in a free society it was entirely possible to do so and get it published. At one point, Gorbachev later recalled, the conversation became so heated that he and Mrs. Thatcher turned away from each other. Then I caught Raisa's eye across the table, and her lips moved to say, "It's over," and for a moment I wondered if we should leave. But suddenly Mrs. Thatcher changed tone. The Prime Minister said that the difficult part of their discussion was now over. In Tony Bishop's view, she was signalling to Gorbachev that he'd passed the first audition. He responded in kind, welcoming her remarks, and proposed a toast, celebrating the good atmosphere prevailing around the table. Lunch ended, and the principals adjourned for a smaller and more informal meeting in the main sitting room. Dennis left, and Raisa enjoyed a tour of the house with officials. The lunchtime conversation between Mrs. Thatcher and Gorbachev had been one of the most remarkable ever to have taken place across that dining table. It defied all diplomatic norms. It produced almost nothing but disagreement, and the sharpness of its tone exceeded all the usual Foreign Office euphemisms, such as frank or candid. Yet the occasion was, quite clearly, a success, and was immediately recognized as such by both sides. Gorbachev's Marxism, thought Mrs. Thatcher, was standard stuff, but his personality could not have been more different from the wooden ventriloquism of the average Soviet apparatchik. Those present on the British side were struck by Gorbachev's physical vitality. He was so visibly not one of the older men, recalled Charles Pole, who noted, this short, energetic man bouncing on the balls of his feet. I think everybody was caught by surprise. She certainly was. From neighbouring armchairs in the sitting room, and joined only by Howe, Pole, and Bishop on the British side, Mrs. Thatcher and Gorbachev got down to a less argumentative discussion about arms control. They sat in front of the fire. Occasionally, Mrs. Thatcher herself would approach the hearth and toss on a new log to revive the flames. Mrs. Thatcher explained that she had decided that she must try to do something to engage with the Soviet Union. There was no point in one system trying to convert the other, she said. The point was to diminish hostility and the level of armaments. In making these arguments, she boasted, Britain had a bigger influence with the United States than any other NATO member. She was worried that unless the two sides could agree on how to deal with the problem of weapons in outer space, there would be a new spiral in the arms race. This enabled her to make her point, which she so often put to bridge the gap between Americans and Europeans, that Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative research was fine, but translation into weapons production was another matter altogether. The Americans did not want to dominate the world, she said. The freeze in relations had more to do with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Reagan saw the Soviet Union as a country combining immense patriotism with the aim of the worldwide victory of the communist system. Naturally, he felt fearful and suspicious, but the last thing he would ever want was a war. Gorbachev replied that he disagreed with Mrs. Thatcher's friendly account of U.S. intentions, but agreed with her about the value of talking. "What we need now is a process," said Gorbachev, suggesting that their dialogue should continue. This, according to Tony Bishop, was music to the PM's ears. Those with Mrs. Thatcher that day noticed her excitement. At the end, she felt very elated. "This really was something new," recalled Charles Pole. Tony Bishop looked upon the occasion with his interpreter's eye. "It struck me not just as an observer, but as one who had to be her voice and reflect her tone, that at such times I was witnessing something akin to a flirtation between two people with much to gain from and offer to each other." Gorbachev did not leave for London until 6, making him nearly 2 hours late for a reception at the Soviet embassy. Mrs. Thatcher lingered briefly with her officials before exclaiming, "Tomorrow it's China, and I haven't had my hair done." She ran upstairs and was gone. Arthur Scargill, president of the National Union of Mine Workers, liked to see himself in an ideological and heroic role. At the end of May 1984, he began a series of mass pickets designed to stop coke being moved from the British steel coking works in Orgreave, South Yorkshire. On the 18th of June 1984, the climactic Battle of Orgreave took place. The pickets, estimated at between 5,000 and 10,000 strong, confronted about 5,000 police. Conducted in a series of advances and retreats, in some of which police horses forced back the pickets, the battle was fierce, but the NUM never succeeded in preventing the lorries loaded with coke from leaving the plant. 28 police officers and many more pickets were injured, and 93 arrests were made. Mrs. Thatcher's private secretary, Andrew Turnbull, recalled that Orgreave looked like the Wars of the Roses, and it carried the implication of civil war which goes with that comparison. The contest produced images of violence which could be deployed by both sides. Orgreave quickly became a talismanic name in the legends of trade unionism. A Gallup poll in July 1984 showed that 79% of the public disapproved of the methods used by the NUM. More important still, Orgreave proved that in enormous confrontations, the police now had the numbers, the equipment, and the will to prevail. The defeat of Scargill's pickets at Orgreave also emboldened miners who wanted to return to work. In the last full week in June, the number of those at work rose by 1,400 on the week before, bringing the total working to 53,000. It was clear that the attempt to break the will of the working miners had failed. It did not automatically follow, however, that the government would win. It remained possible that key trade unions would combine successfully against it. It was a National Coal Board, NCB, mishandling, which brought about the single most dangerous moment of the entire strike. In the completely unionized world of coal mining, there were other minor unions, as well as the mighty NUM. Of these, the elaborately named National Association of Colliery Overseers, Deputies and Shot Firers, NACODs, had an importance beyond its modest numbers. This was because its members were chiefly responsible for safety. If safety cover were not present, the pits would be legally obliged to close. Then Arthur Scargill would very likely win. In the middle of August, seemingly without thought for the consequences, the Coal Board issued a circular to NACOD's members ordering them all to cross picket lines on pain of losing pay. Until that point, many NACOD's men who were employed on strike-bound pits were allowed to stay away on full wages. Since the NACOD's men in a ballot in April had voted for a strike, though not by the 2/3 required to trigger action, this was a dangerous move. The leaders of the union were more sympathetic than most of their members to Arthur Scargill. Now they grasped their moment. They called a strike ballot for the 28th of September. "I always thought the miners could defeat Thatcher," Ken Livingstone remembered. "I thought NACODs could do it." For Downing Street, this mess confirmed the belief that the Coal Board was no good at running the dispute. The NACOD's leaders demanded not only the withdrawal of the NCB's circular, a wish which was easily granted, but also their own solution to the question of uneconomic pits, on which all talks with the NUM had foundered. They proposed a system of independent, binding arbitration when the closure of any pit was proposed. The government tactic in response was to get the Coal Board to string NACODs along in talks. The strike start was delayed, but the threat still hung in the air. The Conservative Party conference at Brighton in 1984 is remembered for the IRA bombing of the Grand Hotel in the early hours of the morning of Friday the 12th of October. Mrs. Thatcher, who was working on the final drafts of her conference speech when the bomb went off, survived unscathed, but 5 people were killed, and many others were injured, some very seriously. Public sympathy switched at once to Mrs. Thatcher's side. She was widely praised for turning up at the conference as planned on the Friday morning to give her annual leaders' speech. The version of the speech which she delivered on the day after the bomb moved the miners' strike well down the order and got rid of the attacks on Labour. But while Mrs. Thatcher pruned the most partisan elements, she kept some of the strongest phrases. "Scabs, they are lions," she said of the working miners. For her, what was going on was the battle to uphold the rule of law and the right to go to work of those who have been denied the right to go to vote. She concluded, "The nation faces what is probably the most testing crisis of our time, the battle between the extremists and the rest. This nation will meet that challenge. Democracy will prevail." The extremists at the top of people's minds were now, of course, the IRA, but she meant Arthur Scargill and his militants too. At the end of September, the High Court upheld an attempt by 2 working miners, Robert Taylor and Ken Falston, to have the strike declared unlawful. A writ alleging subsequent contempt was later served on Scargill, who was defying the court. Scargill was personally fined £1,000 and the union £200,000 for the contempt, with the threat of sequestration of the union's assets if the fine was not paid. An attempt was made to kill Taylor at Manton in Nottinghamshire when he was visiting his mother after the death of his father, and the secretary of the local NUM was charged with threatening to kill. An order sequestrating the NUM's assets was issued on the 25th of October. Eventually, the sequestrators found and froze £8 million of NUM money hidden in Dublin, Luxembourg and Zurich. Defiance of the court might be popular with enthusiastic strikers, but it drove the NUM into the position of an impoverished outlaw and into the arms of dangerous friends. On the 28th of October 1984, the Sunday Times revealed that Roger Windsor, the chief executive of the NUM, had visited Libya to solicit money to support the strike from the country's dictator, Colonel Gaddafi, whom he met. Later, the paper established that $200,000 reached the NUM from this source. This visit had been arranged with the backing of Scargill, but without the knowledge of the NUM executive. Libya was known to supply arms to the IRA, and in April a gunman inside the Libyan embassy in London had opened fire on anti-Gaddafi demonstrators outside, killing WPC Yvonne Fletcher, who was policing the protest. British intelligence had known what Scargill was up to and how money was being moved. Mrs. Thatcher was aware of this and of covert leaks to help the cause. It duly emerged in the press that Scargill himself had visited Paris for a secret meeting to get money from the Soviet Union. $1.4 million was authorized to be paid across, although the operation had been abandoned when the Swiss bank had grown suspicious. It would have been hard for anti-Scargill propagandists to have constructed a less favourable picture than the actual truth. Here was the miners' leader consorting secretly with the enemies of his country, the enemy within and the enemy without. All through the dispute, There were horrible attacks on working miners and their families. The wife of one working miner was held down by youths in Nuneaton, while others scraped her face with a Brillo pad to remove the scab. On the 30th of November 1984, the violence reached a dreadful climax. A 3-foot concrete garden post was thrown from a road bridge at a taxi carrying a working miner on the way to the Merthyr Vale pit in South Wales. The miner was unhurt, but the driver, David Wilkie, was killed. "I have said," Bernard Ingham wrote to Mrs. Thatcher, "that you are horrified and utterly condemn this murderous activity." Arthur Scargill, who had previously avoided any criticism of violence, was forced to condemn this attack. He did so on a platform shared by Neil Kinnock, and when he uttered the word "condemn," Kinnock leapt up to applaud. This meant that Scargill's full words were drowned out. What he actually said was that he condemned such attacks when they happened away from picket lines. The effect of Wilkie's killing, for which 2 miners were sentenced to life imprisonment, a sentence later reduced to 8 years after the conviction was changed from murder to manslaughter, was to lower the level of violence. By the 4th of December 1984, a total of 8,688 arrests had been made in the course of the dispute. Now the fight went out of them. As well as disgusting wider opinion, the violence did not stop the return to work. This picked up as soon as the NACOD strike was called off on the 24th of October, when the executive realized that they did not have the necessary support from their members, who were less left-wing than they. By the 7th of November, 72,000 men were working, roughly 30,000 more than at the beginning of the strike. A further 6,000 returned in the course of the next week. On the 3rd of March 1985, a special delegate conference of the NUM voted to return to work without a settlement. Scargill promised that guerrilla warfare would continue. Men went back to the pits, some marching to the music of colliery bands. Mrs. Thatcher had won the most important single victory of her career. Naturally, she did not put it this way. "If anyone has won," she said outside 10 Downing Street, "it has been the miners who stayed at work, and all those that have kept Britain going." Mrs. Thatcher had won the key industrial relations battle of the post-war era, but she felt she could not say so publicly. The calculation was that the public were relieved by the defeat of Scargill, but also distressed by the amount of conflict which it had entailed. Their feeling that Mrs. Thatcher was too confrontational a figure would only be exacerbated if she were to drive her victory home. Without a full explanation from Mrs. Thatcher and her colleagues of what they had achieved, the field was open for the mythologizing of the strike by the left, something which achieved its apogee in the film Billy Elliot. 30 years on, it was commonplace to find people talking about the strike who had no idea of its central distinguishing feature, that it was called and continued without a ballot. To return to the metaphor of war which dominated the entire year, one could say that she fought a battle which she saw as necessary rather than welcome. Even Ian McGregor, with whom she had many disagreements, was in no doubt about her leadership. "If you fight a war," he told Tim Bell when it was all over, "you want a great general." She was a great general. Mrs. Thatcher's opposition to economic sanctions designed to put pressure on the white minority government, and her decision to maintain contact with the Prime Minister, later State President P.W. Botha, were extremely controversial policies. She was accused at home and abroad of being a sympathizer with apartheid. In Mrs. Thatcher's mind, however, there was a purpose behind all this conflict. She wished to assert Britain's right to its own trade. Britain was one of South Africa's largest trading partners and the largest single investor. She believed that British influence could do more for the multiracial future of South Africa by engaging with its white government than by shunning it. Mrs. Thatcher was never instinctively enthusiastic about international institutions, although some, such as NATO, she regarded as essential. She resented their loquacity and what she saw as their hypocritical self-righteousness. She also regarded many of them as conspiracies against Western interests, keen to impose limits on her country's power. The Commonwealth was a particularly awkward case in point. It was, of course, the British Commonwealth in origin, though no longer in name. In principle, Mrs. Thatcher liked the idea of a global family of the English-speaking peoples, a phrase of Winston Churchill's which she loved to borrow. However, she was annoyed that the Commonwealth refused to look at the tyrannical practices of some of its own members, and she felt that it liked to forge a too-easy unity over South Africa, designed to put Britain in the dock. She was particularly incensed that Commonwealth countries which had little or no trade with South Africa tried to lay down the law on economic sanctions. Towards the end of June 1986, the Queen received a letter from Desmond Tutu. The black people of South Africa had been loyal to her, he wrote, at a time when Hendrik Verwoerd, Prime Minister of South Africa from 1958 to 1966 and the arch-exponent of apartheid, had not been. Now he made an appeal. Madam, our country is on the brink of a monumental catastrophe. He was aged 54, he said, a bishop and a Nobel Prize winner, but he could not vote. The South African government was being protected in its appalling behaviour by Britain, the United States and Germany. Why were there no sanctions against the most vicious system since Nazism? Your Majesty, this is a cri de coeur. Please help us bring about a new South Africa. The letter immediately raised the ticklish problem of who should answer it. Since it came to Buckingham Palace from an Anglican bishop, by hand of the Archbishop of Canterbury's special representative Terry Waite, it might seem to be an appeal to the Queen in her role as Supreme Governor of the Church of England. On the other hand, since it dealt with foreign policy, should it not be a matter for the Queen's ministers and the Foreign Secretary Geoffrey Howe? Yet again, though, since the Queen was head of the Commonwealth, and a London conference was about to discuss the key matter of sanctions, was this really a matter for a British government at all? This was part of the awkwardness which could be produced by the Queen's different roles. A fortnight after the letter was delivered, Charles Pole laid the problem before Mrs. Thatcher. Bishop Tutu recently wrote to the Queen about South Africa in fairly objectionable terms. The fact of his letter is public. Geoffrey Howe, Pole reported, thought that the politics of the situation would be minimised if the Queen's own private secretary, Sir William Heseltine, were to reply. Heseltine's draft, which Pole enclosed, said that the Queen was conscious of the historical connections to which you allude and has followed developments in South Africa in recent months closely and with great concern. She sought an end to the suffering and an early and peaceful solution to your country's problems, and emphasized the special responsibility of those in positions of influence to speak out against violence. Pole questioned Howe's recommendation. The press would be bound to take it as somehow reinforcing the notion of a difference of opinion between the Queen and you. He suggested that Howe should reply in uncontroversial terms. Mrs. Thatcher agreed. I think the proposed draft does involve the Queen in politics. A variant on the Pole idea was that the British ambassador in South Africa should reply to Tutu. After a week's further cogitation, however, Sir William Heseltine wrote to Howe's office to say that the Queen had considered carefully the pros and cons of a letter to the Bishop from Buckingham Palace or from the ambassador. Her Majesty had agreed it would be wrong to send a reply from the Foreign Secretary himself, and after much thought decided that the balance of the argument rested with a letter from the private secretary. Although the final draft differed little from the one that had worried him and Mrs. Thatcher, Pole, for some reason, acquiesced happily. This is a simple and satisfactory solution, he told Mrs. Thatcher. There were no public explosions about the Queen's reply to Tutu, but the overall situation was not satisfactory for any of the parties. Mrs. Thatcher was absolutely incensed by the suggestion that her stand against sanctions was immoral. On the 9th of July, Mrs. Thatcher publicly denounced her critics. "I find nothing moral," she told Hugo Young in The Guardian, "about them sitting in comfortable circumstances, with good salaries, inflation-proof pensions, good jobs, saying that we, as a matter of morality, will put X 100,000 black people out of work." The proposed fruit and vegetable boycott alone, she claimed, would put 95,000 people out of their jobs. Nevertheless, those who disagreed with Mrs. Thatcher on sanctions increasingly combined against her. Stories grew of royal anxieties about the future of the Commonwealth and dissatisfaction with Mrs. Thatcher's handling of the issue. Some of this appeared in the press. Lawrence van der Post rang Downing Street to say that he had just seen the Prince of Wales, who was very distressed that his mother was being pulled into the current controversy. Prince Charles told Lawrence that they, the royal family, have never been more united behind you. Far from being critical, they have total admiration for your stand. At lunch in Clarence House, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, told Woodrow Wyatt, without prompting, how disgraceful it is that the press and people are trying to involve the Queen in the row about sanctions. She denied any truth in the story that her daughter was at odds with Mrs. Thatcher. I suspect, Wyatt added, she wants me to let Mrs. T know the Queen is not against her. These two well-meant private remarks reflected the desire of the Queen to behave correctly and maintain good relations with her Prime Minister. There is no known evidence that the two women ever exchanged hard words on the subject. But Buckingham Palace did indeed have different interests from Downing Street in this matter, and was working to promote them. The Queen has a lifelong commitment to maintaining the unity of the Commonwealth. It would be tragic for this legacy, Commonwealth supporters believed, if the institution were to break apart over the behaviour of its notorious ex-member, South Africa. On the 20th of July, the campaign to get Mrs. Thatcher to change her mind took a dramatic turn. Under the headline, "Queen Dismayed by Uncaring Thatcher," the Sunday Times reported that the rift between monarch and Prime Minister over South Africa and the Commonwealth was indeed real and went wider. Relying on several briefings by the Queen's advisers who were fully aware it would be published, the paper reported that the Queen considers the Prime Minister's approach often to be uncaring, confrontational, and socially divisive. She felt the government should be more caring towards the less privileged in society, it went on, feared that as a result of the miners' strike, long-term damage was being done to the country's social fabric, and had misgivings about the decision to allow American bombers to use British bases to attack Libya. As the first copies came off the presses on the Saturday night, Buckingham Palace rushed out a statement saying that, "As with all previous Prime Ministers, the Queen enjoys a relationship of the closest confidentiality with Mrs. Thatcher, and reports purporting to be the Queen's opinion of government policies are entirely without foundation." Andrew Neil, the editor of the Sunday Times, was amazed, since the source for the story, which by journalistic convention he could not reveal, was the Queen's press secretary, Michael Shea. Neil was so angry at what he considered to be double-dealing that he refused to print the Palace statement in his later editions, a decision which he afterwards admitted had probably been a mistake. The wording of the Palace statement was not closely studied, a denial, though it intended to give the impression that it was. Shea had indeed told the Sunday Times most of what it published. William Heseltine hurried to the Queen at Windsor. He said to her, "You know, this is going to be quite a screaming match and a sensation. I think it might be a good idea if you made personal contact with the Prime Minister." This the Queen immediately did by telephone to Chequers. She told Mrs. Thatcher that in Heseltine's paraphrase, she could not imagine how the story came to be circulated, and anyway it bears no relation to the truth as I understand it. Queen and Prime Minister had a very amicable conversation. Many people were naturally disposed to believe the palace denial, or apparent denial, which was repeated by Heseltine in a letter to the Times, but it was clear to Mrs. Thatcher that there had been some truth in it. It was suggested that, when asked about the story in Parliament, she should say, "It's the silly season." But Mrs. Thatcher played by the rules and replied, "No, I will say that a denial has been issued from Buckingham Palace, and I have nothing further to say." She stuck to this, even in private. Mrs. Thatcher was almost paralysingly correct about relations with the monarch, and was never heard to gossip about, complain of, or even quote in confidence anything the Queen had told her. After her weekly Tuesday audiences in Buckingham Palace, which by tradition never have any officials in attendance, she would emerge panting for a whisky and soda, to be debriefed by her own and the Queen's private secretaries. The audiences were rarely productive, because Mrs. Thatcher was nervous. She sat always on the edge of her chair and produced from her bag an agenda from which she launched forth. Far from being, as some docudramas and plays have depicted, little speeches in which Mrs. Thatcher laid down the law to the Queen, what she said was usually an anodyne recitation of current business. Heseltine once asked the Queen if it was like Queen Victoria's experience of Gladstone. "He speaks to me as if I were a public meeting." "No," said the Queen, "it wasn't at all like that. But I wasn't given much encouragement to comment on what was said." Mrs. Thatcher never had the confidence to make a friend of the Queen, as some of her predecessors had done, and so their relations were, according to her private secretary, absolutely correct and, perhaps, not very cosy. As she approached the end of her 8th year as Prime Minister, Mrs. Thatcher's battles at home and abroad were well known. Her longevity in office and evident intention to continue only served to confirm her dominance. Everyone recognised her. Everyone had an opinion about her. She embodied the hopes of many and featured in the nightmares of some. Ahead of the general election that would be held in June 1987, many of these critics spoke out. "The chief function of this election," wrote the novelist Julian Barnes, "is to turn out Mrs. Thatcher and her spade cabinet, whose main achievement in the last 8 years has been the legitimation of self-interest." The television playwright Dennis Potter thought Mrs. Thatcher the most obviously repellent manifestation of the most obviously arrogant, dishonest, divisive, and dangerous government since the war. David Hare wrote of Mrs. Thatcher, "She is, as her teams of journalistic galley slaves never tire of telling us, a crusader. Her crusade, however, is exclusively on behalf of herself and those who share her peculiar temperament and ideas." Even without an election campaign, Mrs. Thatcher as Philistine-in-chief was a popular theme with Britain's leading thinkers and cultural figures, many of whom spoke to the journalist Graham Turner for an article which appeared in the Sunday Telegraph. The novelist and travel writer Jonathan Raban saw her as a total Philistine. She doesn't appreciate doubleness, contradictions, paradox, irony, ambiguity. And to her, paintings, books and ideas were just so much Black Forest gatto. Mary Warnock, the philosopher and mistress of Girton College, Cambridge, said that Mrs. Thatcher had a total lack of understanding of what universities were about. Dr. Jonathan Miller, the theatre director and polymath, called her loathsome, repulsive in almost every way, and in remarks which Turner decided not to print, said that she had the diction of a perfumed fart. It was a special gift of Mrs. Thatcher not only to inspire dislike in her opponents, but to goad them into an extravagance of condemnation. As the novelist Ian McEwan perceptively put it immediately after her death in 2013, it was never enough to dislike her, we liked disliking her. Newspaper cartoonists, whose job it is to depict politics through politicians, had a more directly professional challenge about how to deal with Mrs. Thatcher. Nicholas Garland, who was political cartoonist first at the Daily Telegraph and latterly at the Independent throughout her time, recalled that he felt it freakish at first that a woman was in charge. He found Mrs. Thatcher very, very difficult to draw, partly because of her sex. Women change more than men. Hair, outfits, makeup. They are elusive. On the day she beat Heath for the leadership in 1975, he remembered thinking, I just can't do this. Shortly afterwards, Mrs. Thatcher attended a leader writers' conference at the Daily Telegraph, and Garland was able to study her in the flesh. He was surprised to find that this woman turned out to be rather attractive, with considerable presence. As a cartoonist, he began to study her more carefully and noticed that she had slow eyes, the outside corners lower than the inside ones, strong high cheekbones, and a little pursed mouth. He tried to draw in her face the power and the activism which gave her a slightly bad-tempered look, and the underlying possibility of panic expressed in her flashing eyes. Energy came off her. She was good at drama, which is a two-edged thing. She often had one finger raised, haranguing somebody. Or she wielded the handbag as a weapon. Her handbag, of course, was an essential accoutrement for the cartoonist, like a crown for the Queen. Alan Hollinghurst's novel, The Line of Beauty, 2004, perhaps the best-known fiction set in the Thatcher era so far published, tells the story of a young gay man, Nick Guest, experiencing a world that is grander and more glamorous than his own. The setting is the mid-Thatcher period of 1983 to 1987, the height of her power, and Nick, as lodger in the elegant house of a rising Tory politician called Gerald Fedden, witnesses some of it. The high point for Fedden is when he finally persuades Mrs. Thatcher to come to a party held at his house, and she ends up, improbably, dancing, getting down rather sexily with Nick. Describing Mrs. Thatcher's entry to the party, Hollinghurst writes, "She came in at her gracious scuttle, with its hint of a long-suppressed embarrassment, of clumsiness transmuted into power." This observant, if superior way of describing Mrs. Thatcher suggests how fruitful might have been fiction which imagined the circumstances and feelings of her and those like her as they fought to rise in the world. Mrs. Thatcher herself was not interested in how she was portrayed. She had long learnt from hard knocks, going back to the days of Milk Snatcher, not to waste emotional energy on thinking about how others saw her. In her old age, the novelist Sebastian Faulks met her at a lunch party. Faulks told her she should read The Line of Beauty, since she appeared in it. She had not heard of the book, but listened attentively. As they parted, she said to Faulks, "The line of duty. I shall remember that." It was a characteristic mishearing, illustrating the gap between her way of thinking about the world and that of British metropolitan literary culture. Intellectuals with direct experience of real tyranny thought of Mrs. Thatcher very differently from her left-wing critics in Britain. She was greatly admired, for example, by Andrei Sakharov, the Soviet nuclear physicist and dissident, and by Vladimir Bukovsky, the science student and writer who was released from a Soviet prison in 1977 and granted asylum in the West. He felt he could trust her. She was an intensely loyal person. We'd have a great quarrel, usually about her closeness to Gorbachev, of which Bukovsky vehemently disapproved, and then she'd go round introducing me in most flattering terms. The locus classicus for the conflict between Mrs. Thatcher and intellectuals was the row over her honorary degree at Oxford in 1985. This had been foreshadowed in 1983, when the Royal Society, the country's most eminent scientific academy, decided to elect Mrs. Thatcher as the first scientist Prime Minister to its fellowship. 44 fellows of the Royal Society wrote to the magazine Nature to complain that it would be damaging to the good name of the Society to grant her an honorary fellowship. Mrs. Thatcher's cause only narrowly won the two-thirds majority needed when the Society met to vote. In 1981, the sums allocated by the government-funded University Grants Committee had been cut by 18% over 3 years, to which Keith Joseph added a further 2% cut in 1983. This led, by administrative complication rather than political intent, to a disproportionate cutting of the money for pure, that is, non-applied, science. Academic feeling against these trends ran high. When Oxford's Hebdomadal Council proposed Mrs. Thatcher for an honorary degree late in 1984, some of those who had tried and failed to stop her at the Royal Society tried again. When she received the official invitation to allow her name to go forward for the degree, she also got a letter from the conservative historian Robert Blake, who was Provost of Queen's College, Oxford. He said how delighted he was, and told her not to worry about the proviso that a vote on the matter might be taken. It is conceivable that some left-wing don might mount a challenge. I personally think it is very unlikely, but I might be wrong. I am confident, however, that if there were a vote, you would win it. Her opponents were more diligent than her supporters. Drawing particularly on scientists and the Faculty of Politics, Philosophy and Economics, they collected 275 protest signatures, including 11 Fellows of the Royal Society. Their statement said that Mrs. Thatcher's government had done deep and systematic damage to the whole public education system in Britain. Their campaign took off. It drew strength from several factors: the usual anger that people feel when they receive less government money than in the past, a rejection of a vision of the universities which was considered too utilitarian, and a particular feeling against Mrs. Thatcher, heightened by the long-drawn-out struggle of the miners' strike, just then visibly moving towards defeat for Arthur Scargill. Oxford's congregation met to debate the issue on the 29th of January 1985. Denis Noble, a leading physiologist, argued against the degree. "Virtually everyone," he said, "who knows what is happening in the science laboratories of this country is extremely alarmed and deeply worried." The historian, Professor John Vincent, one of the few prominent academics to sympathise with Mrs. Thatcher's subversive conservatism, and himself a victim of attack from the left in the 1980s, identified why she was such an object of hatred. It was because she offered earnest and practical dissent to progressive orthodoxy. Mrs. Thatcher is the point at which all snobberies meet: intellectual snobbery, social snobbery, the snobbery of Brooks's, the Whiggish London Club, the snobbery about scientists, among those educated in the arts, the snobbery of the metropolis about the provincial, the snobbery of the South about the North, and the snobbery of men about career women. What seems most strange in retrospect is how little prominence was given to the point about Mrs. Thatcher being Oxford's own, and the first of her sex. One needs to imagine Harvard refusing an honorary degree to America's first black president, Barack Obama, who attended Harvard Law School, because of disagreement with his education policies, to see how extraordinary the Oxford decision looks today, and looked even at the time to the wider world. Robin Butler's wife, Jill, an Oxford graduate, was clear they would never have done this to a man. Mrs. Thatcher's own public reaction was laconic. "If they do not wish to confer the honour, I am the last person who would wish to receive it." But Robin Butler felt that privately the degree of hurt was huge. Mrs. Thatcher later suggested that the story of her honorary degree showed the comfort family could bring. When the news came through, she said, Mark was in America and saw it on television. He rang her at once and said, "Don't worry, Mummy." And within about 2 hours there were some flowers here. "This kind of closeness," she said, "is part of my life every day." That she cited this example indicates how much the degree refusal had upset her. Looking back on her years in office, Dennis told the present author he reckoned that the saga of the Oxford degree upset his wife more than anything else that happened to her in office, apart from her exit.